Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Liberal Arts in Action Summer Series, brought to you by the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts at Loyola Marymount. We're going to go ahead and get started. If I can ask all of you before we get started to mute your mics. Thank you. Okay, so again, we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Dr. Janet Vera, and I serve as the Assistant Dean in the College of Liberal Arts. And our series is really designed to be a preview, or for many of you, a reminder of what our liberal arts disciplines bring in terms of thought-provoking, well-reasoned explorations to a variety of topics and current events. We do this by spotlighting the work of our faculty and our staff at LMU, which is very exciting. In terms of our upcoming sessions, so let me just show you. We have had several sessions already. Many of those are recorded already. We do have a session coming up on August 10th, where we will hear from Ms. Liz Connolly, an alumni, who will be discussing job prospects during our challenging times. We also look forward to actually adding some additional programs. So be on the lookout for additional workshops and lectures that we will be having. And then you can find this information on our liberal arts website in the events tab. And now I want to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Drummond. She is the chair of LMU's Department of History. We're really excited to have her as part of our series. Dr. Drummond's specialty is in modern European history, and she has produced several scholarship and work in this area. She has also shaped LMU's history department, as many of you probably know, and she has her focus is on public and applied history, in which students focus on debates in public history, including questions of history, memory, commemoration, and identity in the public sphere, as well as issues related to the presentation of public narratives of history. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Elizabeth Drummond to go ahead and begin her session. You are welcome to ask questions throughout the session by using the chat box, and I'll help field those questions as you ask them, okay?
So thanks, Janet, for the introduction, and thanks to Deanna and Janet both for putting together this Liberal Arts in Action series, and then for inviting me to participate. I want to begin by acknowledging that while the participants in this session literally could be anywhere, Loyola Marymount University as a physical place occupies the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva people. I also want to acknowledge the current moment, in part because that's part of the focus of what I'm going to be talking about today. The COVID pandemic, of course, but also the Black Lives Matter protests and the fact that Representative John Lewis is lying in state today. The violent occupation of cities like Portland, a sign of how our growing authoritarianism is moving from the border to the interior of the United States, the spread of far-right movements in the United States and elsewhere, particularly in Europe. There's also a Twitter walkout beginning today to protest anti-Semitism on the site, and a lot more. We live in interesting times, which makes historians very important, both to explain how we got here and to document and make sense of the present. And I want to focus a little bit on the latter today. Just a note before I kind of get into things, another one. In the publicity, we asked you all to bring or to have in mind an artifact or something that is meaningful to you as a representation of this current moment. So if you missed that part of the publicity, then start thinking about things now. You'll have a little bit of time before I'm going to ask you to get more involved in the discussion here. So I want to talk not about my research, but about a curricular initiative in the history department. One that reflects the history faculty's firm belief in the relevance and significance of studying history for being an informed citizen and for understanding and making sense of developments in the world today. That history is both the study of the past for its own sake and for understanding and making sense of developments in the world today. That sorry, I should say that history is both the study of the past for its own sake, because let's be honest, exploring distant times and cultures is a lot of fun. But also because we do make better sense of the world today by interpreting what came before. And by recognizing the different paths, different ways of thinking about things, and the contingencies in history. And I think that recognition enables us to imagine other presents and other possibilities in the future, so that the idea of the inevitable is really an anathema to historians, even though we hear a lot about it in history papers from students. So this curricular initiative that we've begun in the history department is the curricular initiative, or the subfield of public history. We have a new concentration, one of 5, well, now it's almost 2 years old, in public and applied history, which we've developed in the history major and the minor as a department faculty. And as Janet started to indicate, public history explores as a content field the public uses of the past, the stories we tell about ourselves, and how we use history and public and collective memory to inform understandings of collective identities, how those histories are contested, and how an understanding of history can inform public policy. Public history is also practice. And as a practice, it means using the skills of historical analysis to address real-world problems and to present complicated historical narratives for broad audiences. And we do that in a variety of different ways: by curating museum exhibits, by creating websites or blogs, by taking more journalistic approaches to writing history or collaborating with journalists, by writing historical fiction, by making history film, both documentaries and feature films, and increasingly through social media. And history Twitter, the so-called Twitter storians, have a very strong game, for those of you who might be over there on Twitter. So just to offer a few examples of things that we've been doing in the history department before I get into talking about documenting COVID. There's sometimes the impression, I think, that historians sit in dusty archives exploring topics that have no relevance for our world today. And we do spend a lot of time in archives. We do spend a lot of time researching and writing, but we're also constantly speaking to contemporary problems. So in the department, we've developed programming that seeks to contextualize current events in the broader history. Sometimes it's done in a more linear approach. How did we get here? So our plastics event last fall explored the history of plastics consumption and the recycling industry from a global perspective. Sometimes we take a topic very much in the news today and explore that theme in different historical places and times. So our Viral Histories series is quite wide in scope. It ranges from looking at public health and hospitals in the ancient world to looking at the present and focusing on questions of race and disease and more, and all things in between. And I would encourage you to head over to our YouTube channel to check out the playlist, or to follow us on social media, where we'll be posting a few more episodes over the rest of the summer. And we are planning a wrap-up event in the fall. To use my own research field of modern Central Europe, specifically German and Polish nationalisms, there was a time not too long ago when some people, a lot of times journalists and political scientists, maintained that we had moved beyond history, that we had moved beyond the era of nationalism. So what could possibly be the relevance of studying it? Well, these days, of course, the study of German and Polish nationalism seems a lot more relevant than it might have in 1990 or 91 or 92, sometimes alarmingly so, with the Law and Justice Party in Poland and the rise of the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. And of course, German historians spend a lot of time these days talking to a broader public about fascism and authoritarianism, not just in Germany. The goal of this kind of work of public history is to take scholarship that often has a quite limited audience and generally requires a certain expertise to really engage, and to then translate it for a broader public, to provide the kind of historical understanding that is necessary for understanding complex developments in the world today. This kind of work can often be politically fraught. A friend of mine has often described the discipline of history as inherently subversive, because it complicates the simple, generally positive narratives we have about the communities to which we belong. whether the nation or a race or a church or a university. Introducing complexity means grappling with and working through our history, including the darker bits, a process that Germans refer to as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, a nice, good German word that captures a very complex process and that all of my students know by really the end of the first week of class. So in the German case, this means the process of working through the history of Nazism and the Holocaust first and foremost. But in recent years, historians have pointed out the need to do this as regards Germany's colonial history as well. In the United States, it's about complicating the narrative of American exceptionalism and the history of the founding, and about addressing issues of slavery and settler colonialism. And here I think we can really see how politicized these things can become, how polarizing history can become. So for example, the New York Times 1619 project, spearheaded by the journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was a history major at Notre Dame, has reframed the US origin story, identifying 1619 rather than 1620 or 1776 as the decisive date. This shift is not new for historians. These conversations have been happening in historical scholarship already. But publicly questioning a sort of quote unquote official narrative of the United States has proved a lightning rod. It's been a radical change in how we tell the story of the US, particularly around issues of race. So most recently, conservative politicians, well, even when it first came out, conservative politicians attacked the project. And most recently, I want to go back here. Oops, can I go back? There we go. And most recently, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas wants to prevent it. He's introduced a bill to prevent the 1619 project from being taught in the schools because it challenges the understanding of the past that he grew up with, a past that is also usable for his own ideological project. I mentioned Twitter before, and social media has enabled academic historians to speak directly to a broader public. So there are a number of historians who write long threads providing historical context and challenging narratives that are more myth than history. People like Kevin Cruz, Heather Cox Richardson, Kevin Gannon in US history, but also someone like Waitman Bjorn in German history. On the right, you can see the beginning of a Twitter thread about a conference plenary session that, because it was virtual, had a much larger audience than normal, and then also exploded into controversy on Twitter, with people strongly criticizing a plenary speaker who offered an apologia for Andrew Jackson. And in the process, what the response on Twitter did was it brought the work of Indigenous historians and historians working on Indigenous history to a much broader public than would normally be the case. Public history in doing this work of mediation between academic scholarship and popular history and in complicating official national narratives, the national myths that are celebrated on the public square, also informs public policy. Questions about reparations, questions about land rights and Indigenous peoples, about commemoration. So one of the things that we've done in the department are these history in the headlines events, which connect past and present, but which also speak clearly to questions of public policy. What ought we do with Confederate monuments? How should we approach immigration policy, gun policy, voting rights, and so on? The American Historical Association has a National History Center which does congressional briefings to provide historical context for issues, legislative issues in front of Congress. And one of the big things that's been in the news of late is obviously commemoration and public memory, not just of Confederate monuments, but also other monuments from slave-owning founders to US Army officers who fought on the side of the Union in the Civil War, but perpetrated violence against Native Americans in the American West, and to our own Father Sarah in California, and who is now disappeared from outside the Wanderer building on LMU's campus. In my field, in the German case, these questions revolve around how best to commemorate the victims of Nazism, and now also what to do with figures from German colonial history. So this is the field, sort of a brief introduction to the field of public history and how we've tried to give voice to it in the history department. I've also adopted it as a pedagogical approach in recent years. And I've asked students to think about the public uses of the past around specific topics, and then also to be public history practitioners, in a sense to be evangelists for history, but also to, to dig in and do the primary source research, to engage debates in the historiography, and then to take history to the public, to provide that context, to present complex histories in accessible and engaging ways. And they've done this in a variety of ways. They've had free history lessons, where students in a required methods class that I teach as a public history course went out into the community to talk to people about the history of a particular place. That was the Tongva history of Playa Vista, where, Starbucks customers were accosted by students wanting to talk to them about history, or the particular history of a thing. So the Sarah statue on campus was one of the free history lessons that they did. We claim no credit for its removal. However, that decision was well out of our hands. Students in my classes and in my colleagues' classes have curated museum exhibitions using artifacts from our Department of Archives and Special Collections at the library. The first to do this was Professor Carla Biddle, whose Civil War seminar put together an exhibition with some really great artifacts. Professor Amy Woodson Bolton's class on museums and society did a pop-up exhibition about animals and monsters in the Hannon collection. And it's a shame that that was not a longer exhibition than just one day, because the students really did a great job. Last fall, my method students did an exhibition about LMU history around the question of social justice and how well we live up to our rhetoric. COVID unfortunately closed the gallery, but there is a virtual exhibition version in the form of a story map. And public history can also be digital history, because the digital does expand our audiences. We've got a new public history and digital humanities lab down on the 3rd floor. And we've also had classes do website projects, sometimes in connection to global immersion courses. So on the left, on the top, one of Professor Woodson Bolton's classes, a global immersion class to Manchester, did a website project in connection with the Horsfall space in Manchester. She also had a topics in public history course about the British Empire, and they produced a website talking about the contested representations and contested understandings of Britain's imperial legacy. On the right, my Nazi Germany class, which has a global immersion to Berlin, has done 2 different websites projects with different elements. One included a timeline that actually was published by an undergraduate research journal. And whereas historians generally spend a lot of time researching and writing by themselves, public history is very different. It is a collaborative project. You can see that in the museum exhibitions that our students have done, where they've worked together in groups, but also where we've collaborated with the library and with librarians and archivists. You can see that in Amy Woodson Bolton's Horsfall Space project, which was a collaboration with an organization in Manchester. You can also see it in the 2 collaborations that I've had with the Venda Museum here in Culver City, but one a virtual exhibit and then one a story map project that used in part artifacts from the museum. And that focus on collaboration is developed and fleshed out in the field of public history around the idea of shared authority. It is the idea, shared authority is the idea that the academic historian is not the only one who with authority or expertise, but also that practitioners in related fields, including archivists, librarians, museum curators, filmmakers, journalists, have their own expertise and skills that they can bring to bear on a subject. But shared authority means even more than sharing with other trained professional historians. It also means bringing in people who have experienced certain historical developments and or the broader community into the process of producing historical narratives. And so in this sense, public history, I think, is a little bit similar to the kind of engaged or community-based research that Cheryl Grills discussed in the last webinar, where it's a collaboration between academics and the broader community. So this fall, when I teach the methods course, I'm doing it to connect and tap into the theme of the Bellarmine Forum on transformative justice. So the focus will be on prison history and more generally the history of policing, mass incarceration, and carceral institutions. And this is a field where shared authority has really been central to the way the field has developed in recent years, where it's included the voices of incarcerated people, of formerly incarcerated people, of victims, of lawyers, and others involved in the criminal justice system, even of the communities that surround prisons. And there have been a lot of interesting projects that have done just this. Oral history projects like the Prison Public Memory Project, the Women's History Project that Michelle Jones has written about, which was a project where incarcerated women themselves wrote the history of the women's prison in which they were incarcerated. Michelle Jones is no longer incarcerated and is working on a PhD in history. And this kind of approach of sort of bringing in the audience, bringing in your visitors and readers can move beyond things like oral history or the co-curation of exhibitions to recognizing that visitors to museum exhibitions are never blank slates. So on the right-hand side of the screen, the Eastern State Penitentiary has an exhibition about mass incarceration that begins by asking people if they have ever broken the law, and then sends them on different paths through the exhibition as a recognition that their experiences matter in terms of how they shape and go through this museum. We're actually hoping to have a fall program with someone from Eastern State and then someone also from the Levine Museum in the New South, which had a very interesting civic-minded response to a police shooting in Charlotte. In my own course, one of the things that we're going to do is partner with the Loyola Project for the Innocent on an oral history project and perhaps a virtual exhibition. And that brings me then to COVID, because we're also going to be doing this kind of work in the inaugural history learning community, but around the history of COVID-19. In the context of this pandemic, there has been actually a huge number of collecting projects that have emerged, including one here at the William H. Hannon Library on the bottom right there, which is inviting students in particular to share their stay-at-home experiences with the university archives. But also the Autry Museum of the American West is doing a collecting project, asking for artifacts and stories. The California Historical Society is soliciting people to contribute their stories during COVID-19. And then there's a big digital humanities project, a journal of the plague year, out of Arizona State University, but with contributors and curators from a variety of institutions. These projects all rest on this notion of shared authority, of crowdsourcing for artifacts and stories that ordinary people think important and worth preserving as something that can help us understand this moment in time, as something that helps to create meaning for us now, but also for future historians and readers of history. So one of the things that we're going to be doing in the learning community is to contribute our own artifacts to these projects. And I'm going to leave it to the students to decide exactly which projects they want to work with and how they want to do that. They'll also be using artifacts to talk about a particular COVID-related theme of their choosing. And one student has already begun this in a CERT project over the summer, looking at how museums have responded to the stay-at-home orders and the safer-at-home orders, where the closures of physical spaces meant that museums had to engage with the public in a very different way in a virtual space. So it's at this point then that I want to pause for a moment and get you all involved in doing this kind of collecting and documenting that is central to these sorts of projects. So as I mentioned, the publicity for today's event asked you all to bring an artifact with you, or at least to have something in mind that is meaningful to you in terms of understanding your experience of COVID and all of the related things around COVID. And I should say that if any of you is willing to add your artifact or story to our history learning community project, I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment. Please get in touch with me. I'd love to have students be able to bring those things in. So let's see what you have. You can raise your hands. You can bring yourself in. I don't know where my cursor went here. There we go. I can try with the help of Janet to see who might be willing to be the first person to take the plunge and share. Oh, of course, it's going to be Amy. So Amy, go ahead and unmute yourself if you want.
I came prepared.
Very good.
Okay, so what I brought is a series of doodles, and I'm gonna I'm showing one right now. These are doodles that I did with my son in the early days of the lockdown because a video, an artist, an illustrator, children's illustrator named Mo Willems through the Lincoln Center did these amazing half-hour programs for kids. And he taught us how to draw many of his characters. This is Piggy from the Gerald and Piggy. And I've forgotten the name of that first character that I showed you. He also taught us how to make a little game that you just, using pen and paper and a dice. And he had us do, various little things. But in the early days of the pandemic, I found these little 20 to 30 minute breaks just like absolutely crucial for my mental health. And I loved them. And then he stopped doing them. He only do 3 weeks because he has a job, right? So it's weird because now I look back on these doodles that I did at the time and I feel this weird nostalgia because at the time, of course, we didn't know how long it was going to last. So there's like this very weird, bittersweet quality to my experience of those doodles now.
Tony, and then Charla.
Hi, everybody. So I also came prepared with this, which, as many of you have probably experienced, getting haircuts in the time of COVID is a challenge. And I'd let my hair get very shaggy, and I did not like the way that it looked. I certainly did not like the way that it felt, but I was feeling very trapped in the whole thing. Do I run the risk when it was possible to get a haircut? Do I run the risk? And of course, it gets to what Amy was saying. Like, we didn't know then, and we do not know now how long this is going to last. But buying this, it was back ordered. It was actually not easy to get this online, but buying a set of clippers where I could cut my own hair was amazingly liberating and made me feel like I might just possibly make it through this thing without losing my sanity altogether. I don't like the way that it looks. This is not my preferred haircut, but it feels a heck of a lot better than it did when it was long. And again, it has been something very meaningful to me. You cannot put it in the exhibit because I will be needing this for some time to come, I imagine. But when it's all over, I'm happy to donate it to whatever permanent museum there might be for this.
Excellent. So I've got Charla, I think. Did you have your hand up at one point, Charla?
Yeah, I did. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. I'm an alum of the program, so nice to check out this event. So this is what I brought. It is a Fuji Instax camera. So it's kind of like a Polaroid, so it just makes like little Polaroid films. And so I've been just going around this Los Angeles and taking pictures of things, especially different like quarantine murals. There's been a lot of murals promoting social distancing or health, and then now the Black Lives Matter movement. So I've just been taking little pictures, and I like the Polaroids because, I can hang them up and have that instant gratification. And so I have like a little file of all the different things that have been kind of happening week to week as we quarantine.
Great. So Tina Yatrusis, if you want to unmute yourself. And I know a couple of people came in through chat, yeah. So.
Hi, yes. I have always done a little garden, always grown tomatoes. This year with the whole thing in March, I looked at my backyard and I turned half of it into a vegetable garden, which is really awesome. And this is actually fennel seed I've been collecting. I'm going to have many jars of fennel, oregano, we're making pickles, and a lot more. But the garden has always been meaningful to me, and the experience has been, as first it's like, well, I've got this earth, I should produce food for us and anyone else that I can help. And it just is a constant point of reflection for me while I'm working in the garden and looking at how I'm going to keep it producing different things through the year.
Great. Brian?
Sorry, I had to unmute. So I'm smiling as I hear a bunch of you because there's so much common experience here. I saw Dean Crabtree hold up her flower. My hair is growing out like Tony's. I'm gardening like Tina. But the thing I thought to bring was swim trunks, which are still wet from this morning because although I've been doing a lot of things to keep myself sane, like baking and gardening and things like that, one thing I've been doing is at least every morning, sometimes twice a day if I go in the afternoon as well, I just head straight down off campus to the beach near Playa del Rey and swim in the ocean for 15 minutes or so, because I feel so confined being locked at home. My family and I normally spend so much time out in the mountains, climbing and hiking and backpacking, and a lot of that has been harder to do in the shutdown, but the beach is just 4 miles from my house, and so I've just been plunging in, not even really swimming for a workout. It's more like a baptism than an actual workout. But like twice a day, it's one of the only things keeping me sane.
So I'm going to pick up Christiane Funk, who raised her hand through the chat.
Hi, is that working out? Oh,
yep.
Perfect. Oh gosh, wow, I need to put something on the face. Maybe my eyes and lack of makeup should just go in the exhibit as part of Zooming all day and not having to go through the normal morning routine. My item, which not many artifacts come shrink wrapped. I'll see if I can get it without too much glare. So this is a sort of coffee table history book. This one's mine specifically, that my women's fraternity, we are not a sorority, and I can explain that later if anyone cares. We were supposed to have, and we are having, our 150th sesquicentennial this year. There was a small gathering in January on the date when our founding hit 150. Thankfully, I went to that. We were supposed to be in Indianapolis, probably about 1,000 of us celebrating. That's where we were founded. It's, if you didn't read it, Kappa Alpha Theta. And obviously, because of everything that's happened, that was called off. That was, and still is, a big disappointment to a lot of people. But the reason this book is what I would pick versus Lysol wipes, toilet paper, etc., is that things that had already been in place, we've had a DE&I work group since 2013. There have been discussions even longer about ways to improve the diversity, equity, and inclusion in our historically white organization. That has really ramped up, as I think all can probably understand why. And I'm participating in that as much as I can as an advisor to a local college chapter here in San Diego, online, etc. I'm trying to make a long story less long. Basically, this book, which I have not yet opened, I literally just got it on Saturday, and covers our history, will forever be a touch point for me of this entire experience. Not because it's only about me being in this organization, but everything that has touched on that, the stay at home, the don't travel, the getting together, not getting together virtually. We've had Zoom connections. So all of the things beyond the very shared sort of toilet paper experiences will be something that my mind goes to when I do open this, which I'm also still a little bit like, do I want to? How will that feel? How will I now feel about our history, etc. And my part in this as a volunteer archivist for our organization. So thank you for giving me the chance to share.
Great. I also see that Lynna Landry talked about in the chat her standing desk and blue light glasses, which have really helped her continue to teach her high school students AP US History and Government and Econ at St. Mary's Academy. Carol Raby.
Thank you. Good to see you. So I want to echo what Brian Traynor said about the commonality. I have herbs in empty prescription bottles because they're just the right size, and the caps are easy to get on and off, and I have been exercising 6 days a week. I go on a long walk for sanity. So I get it. But the thing that I brought today is the last day that I worked with students was March 13th. And my student was still on campus living in the dorms at that point, and not planning to go home right then, although she did go home shortly after that. And she gave me a drawing because she graduated, and we just said, I don't know when we'll see each other again. So this is an amazing drawing, I think, from a student who never took a drawing course until her last semester, senior year, and didn't think that she had much talent for drawing. Okay, she's since reassessed. And this is from a photograph on my Instagram of my cat, Milo, who has, and I keep it right to the left of me in my kitchen window office. And to the right of me is the refrigerator, which Milo gets on top of and peers down at me like an oppressive supervisor. So I have a lot of photographs of him on that Instagram, supervising me in way inappropriate ways. And so this is very precious for me for so many reasons.
Great, thank you. Dean Crabtree.
Hello, everybody. I brought two things. One is flour, because this was harder for me to get than toilet paper in the early days of the pandemic, as was vanilla. That took even longer. And I am kind of fascinated by how all of the baking projects, I mean, I've been sort of slow to the baking, slow to the gardening, slow to some of the things, because the first few weeks were just such intensive work. But then when you start to realize, oh, you're working remotely and you can do more than one thing at a time because you're at your home. And so baking has been one of those things. It's something that I've always enjoyed my whole life and not had a lot of time for, certainly as dean. But I've been fascinated to see how much through social media and news stories and so on, people are doing back to basics sort of activities and doing them as families. And the ways that eating and food become such a coping mechanism. As the protests began, and I have at least 3 of the most critical risk factors to COVID. And so I've been as cloistered as I can possibly be. And I have a long history as an in the streets protester. So I found it actually very frustrating for me. And we wanted to be in driving, in car protests. And so I'm like, well, I have to have a sign for my car. I don't have school supplies. I don't have children. I don't have craft supplies. I'm like, where am I going to get paper to make a poster? And so I went into boxes, because closet cleaning is another part of this whole business, boxes of old art and posters and so on. And I wrote on the back of a poster, and I don't know if you guys can see this if I back up, but it is a poster that I still own from the very first march I think I ever did other than on campus. This was my first, sort of statewide. It had some national, and so it was interesting to pull out and to repurpose something for the same purpose. But one of the May 3rd Coalition, this was a UC, largely University of California, multiple campus organized event that we had up in San Francisco, and racism, sexism, and all bigotry. And it was almost 30 years ago. And sorry, almost 40 years ago. Sorry, almost 40 years ago. I'm in denial. So it was just interesting as I was looking for paper I could write on. This is the poster I found. It was framed. I took it out of the frame. And I don't know. I mean, mostly it made me, I don't know, pretty sad.
Thank you. Monica.
Hi, everybody. Well, what I brought is this, the Surface Pro pen. Actually, I have 1 and 2, because without this little object, I wouldn't have been able to teach last semester. And I think I would not be able to teach in the fall. This little object helped me write on PowerPoints while in Zoom, or use the whiteboard and grade my student papers and give them the feedback that I usually give them. So it's a very simple tool, but it allowed me to communicate with my students as I wanted, and as closest to face as I could last semester.
Great. Cheryl.
Zoom on my phone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I brought 2 things. One is my laptop, because my laptop is a symbol of how we are overworking that little device. Mine has crashed on me, and it's not that old. It has overheated on me. And so now I'm afraid, it's on the table with a external hard drive backing up stuff that I have on there. Mm-hmm. And some of the stuff that I have on there, I can't wait to share with you, Elizabeth, and hoping maybe our classes can work together, because I've been collecting stories from folks in the jails, in the LA County jails, about how COVID has been impacting them. And that's in my role as a commissioner. But so there's a lot of opportunities there, and I could actually collect the stories for the students. They tell me the questions to ask, and I can give them the data that we've already, well, not data, the information we've already collected. Wow. But I was also torn. I brought this as well, which is one of Harriet Washington's books. But this one and her book, Medical Apartheid, is an incredible collection of information, historical information about the interaction between Black folk and institutions of health and medical research. Mm-hmm. The horrible history of medical research on Black folk that most of America doesn't know anything about. So to me, it's like we're capturing new pieces of information, and we're trying to uncover important information that has just been kept from us for far too long, that if we understood it, I think we would have had a much different society than we have today. Thank you. I'm enjoying your talk. I'm so excited. I can't wait to talk to you offline.
Oh, yes, definitely. We must. John, and then I see Alexis and Robin raising their hands in the traditional way. So, John?
Unlike the students in Elizabeth's courses, I didn't do the assignment in advance, but I happened to be sitting across from some photos, including this photo from my grandmother. It's not dated, but I'm guessing it's from the late 20s, early 30s. And when I think about sort of the way history can instruct us, I think about oral history, I think about the complexity, the human condition, the Great Depression, things that speak to human resilience. And in this time of a pandemic, when we are stretched, as everyone's been noting, in so many ways, I think back to those who have overcome other crises, and good historians learn from the past, right? So we don't repeat it. This is an unprecedented pandemic, but at the same time, I think there's a lot to learn from those who came before us.
Mm-hmm. Great. Alexis?
Hi, sorry about that. I'm an idiot when it comes to Zoom. I couldn't find the button to tell somebody. I'm a psychology person, so I've been really focusing on the whole social aspect and how it's affected social groupings. My neighborhood is a really interesting neighborhood. We live just down the road from Village Green, and it's an apartment neighborhood. And a couple of really interesting things. One, I think the number one thing that's really impacted the neighborhood in a positive way has been the city not giving you tickets for not moving your car. And in a neighborhood, I'm serious, it sounds so stupid, but in a neighborhood where double parking is a way of life, that has meant so much less stress on the neighborhood, and people are a lot less, anxious about that. The other thing is, I have the most wonderful, I don't know if you can see, the most wonderful goddaughter whose little boy turned 8 in July, and she had to create a birthday for, and it's just a normal, right, transitional thing in life. And so she created a birthday scavenger hunt for him, where she drew out a map of all the people that she wanted him to see on his birthday, and sent us each a clue so that he would come to us. We actually did a 10-minute happy birthday with a muffin and a candle and a present and all. But seriously, it was 10 minutes in, out, done. But we had the clue to give to him to make him figure out where he was going next. And so she drove him all around the city to his friends and family. And that was just a really interesting way, I thought, of recognizing, the social impact on just everyday things, like how do we celebrate all of our things that we need to celebrate? And then the last thing was, I know you said not to mention masks, but one of the first things I did is I made masks for my family. I got requests for my neighbors, so I've made them for the apartment complex. I just have a very wide variety of masks, but it's been really interesting connecting with the neighborhood in this really very odd time. I'm closer, I think, to my neighbors now than I have been, and we've been in this neighborhood for 4 years.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to let Robin be the last person, and then I'm going to pull out some of these themes.
Okay, I need to go quick. Now, like Alexis, I just really don't know where to put my name in. So for last 16 years, every summer I was on the road. So this is the only summer I'm stuck in LA. So I have things, one thing that I'm just go quick, the things I'm share is this. 8 pounds weight, okay? So this is a gift for my daughters, and I last year or something. I never use it because I go gym all the time, but now I use this every day. So I walk like this and for a mile and uphill, and it's afternoon walk. While we're doing walk this, I also want to share, I'm listening to the book. Currently, I'm reading this book called Upstream. And it's about how we thinking like upstream thinking. So how we should think about preventative and not just reactions to dealing with, when we're dealing with the problem, we need to look at the system, not just the immediate response. So this is, thank you.
Well, thank you all for bringing such great artifacts. I mean, I think, as we think about what it means to document COVID and to do the history of the present, in many ways, it's really too soon for us to do that, right? It's too soon for us to take the longer look to explain what has happened, regardless of the specific perspective we take. We need the time, we need the ability to look at the variety of sources to really do the kind of in-depth interpretive work that historians do. But by documenting COVID and documenting our experiences, whether in writing or in art or through artifacts, we're preserving primary sources for those future historians who will use them to make sense of this period in time. We're also engaging in acts of interpretation, right? Our selection of specific artifacts, our decision to preserve something rather than something else, our efforts at documentation in writing, in art, or film are acts of interpretation. It's where we privilege certain experiences over others. And in making those acts of interpretation, we're also helping to inform the interpretive lens for future historians, right? Because if we don't preserve some of these more ordinary daily life sorts of things, that changes the look and the way that we interpret these moments in time. So if I think about some of the artifacts that you all have brought, or some of the things that I was thinking about, what would I bring here? Many of them are related to the issues around closures and a certain sense of loss. So I have, these are the cords that we give to all history majors when they graduate. And this year, when we had that day where we could go to our offices and pick up stuff before the campus closed completely, in that extra week of spring break, I did a mad dash and picked up all the cords, all the Phi Alpha Theta sashes, certificates, all the stuff that we usually do for our awards ceremony, because we wouldn't be able to have our normal end of year celebration or award ceremony. And that meant that I then put all this stuff together at home and sent it out. I have a mostly empty scorebook. One of the things I was going to do this year is I got season tickets to LMU baseball. I was going to got a new scorebook. I was going to go to games and score the games. I got to go to one game. So I have one scored game in my now mostly empty scorebook. The university's coronavirus website is its own sort of archive that charts the kind of evolution of a response to COVID. And I think, I mean, talk about a wonderfully interesting research project it will be for somebody to look at how universities responded and to look at all these communications, how they framed things, the stops and starts, the radical U-turns, things like that. I think of Carol's students drawing, right? That's also speaking to a loss, the reunions or parties or birthday parties that we didn't have, but also the way that we've adapted to these closures. So Robin's weights, right? The laptops, the Monica's Surface pen, somebody put in the chat Chromebooks to keep things going. So there's a whole set of artifacts, I think, that are related. And one of the things we're starting to do is we can start to identify, the questions that we might look into. So about loss is a set. There's also a whole set of artifacts related to the economy. Those shortages and supply chain issues that people mentioned, the emphasis on takeout, right, or delivery, the issues around differential effects of the virus, but also of the economic crisis, where we see that certain groups are more vulnerable than others. So, the flower, Cheryl's a book about medical research on Black Americans, the issues around tech divides and things like that. There are artifacts related to public health efforts. So, signs about washing your hands or staying 6 feet distance, all those stickers that are now on floors, right? And these raise a whole host of questions. I ask people not all to bring masks, but masks themselves are going to be a great set of artifacts that, again, will speak to multiple issues, right? Will speak to the issues of a public health response, the debate initially about whether or not to wear masks. They speak to supply chain and economic issues, the deficit of masks, and the fact that many people like Alexis went to making their own masks. Some people actually sewed them. Some people made them out of handkerchiefs and rubber bands or out of old socks. There's a material culture dimension to that, and the history blog Nursing Cleo already has had a really nice essay about the material culture of masks. There's also a consumer culture aspect, right? So all the branded masks that we now have, LMU has its own masks that it's selling along with all other universities. Different sports teams, as they've come back to try and play sports, have their branded masks. Cultural institutions have their branded masks. This one's from, and I don't know if you can see this, this one's from the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, which is also very, has Sei gesund. So it's a little Yiddish and Hebrew for Yiddish, really, for people who are thinking about things. The ways that institutions have picked up on the idea that the mask is now like the t-shirt, right? It's something that we can use to to brand ourselves, whether with a corporate branding or a political statement. So I was born in DC. I've got my nice little 51st state, DC statehood mask, right? And then the emphasis on pretty masks, right? You want to have masks that aren't just the normal sort of things that look nice. So my mother always talks about Nancy Pelosi's masks and what she has there. Artifacts related to all those stay-at-home orders, but also the times when we didn't stay at home. And what I mean by that is the ways that some people have gone to second homes. The ways that we've adapted our vacations, right? So whether it's doodling at home or going to the beach for your daily baptism, or finding ways to adapt to the absence of travel with gardening or photography that Charla mentioned, but also then the way people are going out for protests. And I think the idea that what it means to protest despite a stay-at-home order, and how we make sense of those protests, and that we've seen very different kinds of protests, right? People who are protesting the stay-at-home order itself, but then also people who are going out to protest against racial injustice as something that is so important that we can't not go out, right? And so those sorts of how we start to collect around those things, if it's Robin's sign, if it's a pound of flour, if it's Amy's doodles, those are going to be the kinds of sources that we preserve, interpret, exhibit eventually, that will help craft the historical narratives around this time and place. And so that's some of the stuff that my students will start to do in the learning community this fall. And with that, I don't know how much time. I think we only usually have an hour, which means I've left you 3 minutes for questions. I know there was a question in the chat earlier about what happened to the Sarah statue. I do not know. I just know that he's been disappeared. And I know that there have been discussions in the past about putting him perhaps in the art gallery or in the library, where there can be some contextualization of the statue. But I'm not sure where he is now, but he is gone. So I don't know if there are any other questions or comments.
Yeah, we have time for just a couple of questions.
Charlotte, were you going to say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess I have a question about your thoughts about how individuals might kind of like mark the moment or start to create our own archives around this situation, this whole situation that we find ourselves in.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think people are going to do that in different ways, right? So there's been a push there are many people who said you need to start journaling and everybody should be writing about their experiences, that what we need is that textual record of the event. But you're taking photographs. That's a form of recording and archiving this event. In terms of preservation, there's the additional step of what you then do with those materials. And so there are all these different organizations that really are committed to collecting those materials. Like I said, the LMU Library, but also the Autry Museum, the California Historical Society, but then there's a super, super long list of a variety of different things, different places that will help to archive and preserve for the longer term these kinds of objects. And they're really crowdsourced projects. So you can just go online and use a form to submit your materials, a photograph of your material generally rather than the actual artifact, or to write something that then gets submitted. And I think it's the act of submitting to some of these projects that's going to help preserve these things, because we're individually not very good. I mean, some of us hoard materials, but we're not very good with the longer term preservation. And there's always the question of what happens when you move, or when somebody goes through your things and throws it all away. So if it's something that you think is valuable and meaningful, I would encourage you to submit it to one of these projects. And
Professor
if,
Drummond?
like, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off. I just wanted to ask one question if we're able to.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious, from what you know of the 1918, 1919 pandemic, what has been saved and what maybe was not, whether they thought to or not, what would be something or some category that we now should save, God forbid this occur in another century? Or, you know, I'm trying to think of the things that we were missing that we wish we knew about life then.
Yeah, well, I mean, my colleague, Carla Biddle, is probably better able to answer the question about what was or was not preserved from 1918. I think in general, what I would say, though, is that it is the sort of artifacts that are of the everyday that tend not to get preserved. And so the things that help to shine a light on the experiences of ordinary people and their daily experiences of these sorts of episodes and developments in history. I mean, we're going to have the documents about the government response. We're going to have the documents about the cities or institutional responses. So what often gets lost in that mix is the everyday, what the Germans call the Alltag. But I can't really say specifically what it is that we're going to need to do. And I think with that, Janet, we're at the end of our time.
Yes.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Elizabeth Drummond, for such an engaging conversation on documenting our history and interpreting and kind of how we move forward with all of this. So, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Dr. Cook, Jeffrey Henline, Allison Mullen, and everyone that's helped put this together. And we do have, as I mentioned earlier, additional sessions that we will be offering. So please visit our website if you want to see more. So thank you again.